Welcome to Policy Matters, a program of the Fort Wayne Area League of Women Voters. I'm Nancy McCammon-Hansen. I am the convener of the League of Women Voters here in Fort Wayne. And today we have as our guest Brian Francisco, who is a journalist with the Journal Gazette here in Fort Wayne, and Brian focuses on Indiana politics and government. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Nancy. My pleasure.
And I would like for you to start us off by telling us a little bit about your background in the news business.
Well, I've been working for newspapers in Indiana since 1978. I've covered government and politics at all levels, also business, courts. I've even done a little police reporting. I've covered a little bit of everything, but over the years, my interests have mainly been government and politics. I spent about 20 years at the Muncie Star and the Muncie Star Press before coming to the Journal Gazette in 2000, and since 2011, I have been the federal government reporter for the Journal Gazette, mostly keeping an eye on our congressmen and senators and federal issues and federal programs such as the VA Medical Center here and the 122nd Fighter Wing.
Okay, you partner with Nikki Kelly,
yes,
correct, who is based in Indianapolis.
She's our State House reporter.
And if you want to read their work, one place to get it is on Sunday in Political Notebook.
Yes, that's correct.
Correct,
We
okay.
also publish that online every day. During a week, there may be more items online than there are in the actual print edition. We usually try to condense that down to 3 or 4 items to fit the space that's available.
Okay, you can tell I'm a newspaper junkie. I think of the newspaper before I think of the web. I'd like to start out by asking you how difficult it is in this day and age to cover politics responsibly. And has that changed very much over the course of your career?
The key word there is probably responsibly. It's easier to cover politics in this day and age than it has ever been, I think, for 2 reasons. One, people are just more interested in politics and government. It's become a huge spectator and participation sport for a lot of people. They've always said politics is sports for nerds. Well, there are an awful lot of nerds out there because there's a high demand for political reporting and government reporting. But also I think it's true because public officials have greater access to more ways to communicate with people, thanks to radio, television, social media, newspapers. They're not restricted by old platforms. So both on the political side and the political consumer side, there's just more access, more opportunity to get news, to share views. Of
the people in political office that you know, how many media people do they have on their staff, average?
I deal with a lot of federal officials, Congressman Jim Banks, Senators Todd Young and Joe Donnelly. They all have usually at least 1 or 2 people who are just devoted to communications, but they will have other members of their staff, certainly their chiefs of staff, who will sometimes be involved in interaction with the media, and then the officials themselves. So there's usually 3 or 4 or more people that are equipped to deal with the media.
And is that an increase from when you first started in this business?
No, it's about the same.
About the same? Okay, but I would assume that most of them have at least one person dedicated to social media, or not?
Yes, they do. There's more emphasis on social media. Different lawmakers have different degrees of participation. It's amazing to look at different Twitter accounts and see lawmakers who haven't posted anything in a week or more, and other lawmakers who post several times a day on Twitter. So it's a wide range of participation.
Okay. While we're on the subject of social media, what are your thoughts about how social media has changed the way Americans get their news? And then we'll follow up that question with a question about cable news on TV.
Well, obviously, more people are depending on social media for their news or what they think is news or what passes for news. A lot of times, it tends to be rumor or snippets or views rather than news that people are getting. On the other hand, an awful lot of people, reporters, tend to link to their stories online so that if you are on Twitter or Facebook, you can get an instant link and actually read the news in a newspaper 1,000 miles away, an article that you did not know existed. So it's a little, the best and worst of both worlds. But it certainly has changed the landscape. We have our first Twitter president. The question is, will he be the last Twitter president, or will every president from here on out be expected to be tweeting on a regular basis?
This is not a question that we talked about before, but I'm curious, how do you feel about the media covering the president's tweets as though they're news? Are they news?
I think they are. I think anything that comes from the president has to be considered news. I don't think you can most people might look at tweets as just offhand comments or asides, but when you're the most powerful person in the world, anything you say or do is of extreme importance.
And that leads us to cable news on television. I think most of us have an opinion about cable news on TV. What's your opinion?
I like cable news on television. I think it is great at developing news stories, breaking news stories. The incident, the New York terrorist attack the other day is, a prime example where they can get there first, they can get there fast, they can get the news out. On the other hand, so much of it is opinionated. I like to sometimes toggle between MSNBC and Fox News, and am always amused that there will be one overwhelming event of that day, and one channel will be covering it, the other one will be ignoring it, or they will have opposite takes on the same bit of news. So it's almost comical sometimes how much ideology factors into what is presented as news.
I would agree, having had a journalism school advisor who was just adamant about not putting your opinion into anything, and if you wrote an editorial, it better be well researched. I sometimes am really appalled at some of the people on cable news who are just talking off the top of their head, and you can tell, at least I feel I can tell, that they really don't necessarily know for sure what they're talking about. They're just espousing an opinion, but they're doing it as though it's real news.
Well, you were at Jeff Goldman's
yes.
Lecture the other night at Rifkin campus, and he made the observation that the advent of cable news, they had 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to fill, and to fill that much time, you've got to do a lot of talking.
That's right.
And
you do.
So, you sometimes you throw out facts and information, and you just wing it with opinion.
I'm not sure Ted Turner did us any favors creating CNN sometimes. Kind of switching where we're going with this, how responsible or well-versed do you think the American public in general is when it comes to how our government functions?
That's a loaded question because I know people who are news junkies, who are well-read. They participate. You have people, we can tell it at the Journal Gazette, letters to the editor. You see it at city council meetings. You see it at state legislative hearings, that there are people who are passionate, who are informed, and who really participate in the process. And then you see the occasional articles that say that, and usually this comes around every time we're debating immigration, how I think the statistics are something like between 1/3 and 1/2 of Americans cannot pass the civics test of a U.S. citizenship exam,
which is sad, but
and
true.
Commonly missed questions. How, name the 3 branches of the federal government. That more than half the people can't name all 3. More than half can't name 1. So it is shocking the degree to which people are ignorant or misinformed. So for, I think, every one person who is very up to date on issues and well informed, and even people that just have narrow special interest issues, but who really dive in head first on those issues to get as much information as they can, are balanced out by the person who has little or no interest in the process, or even worse, who is spreading misinformation, disinformation, information that it is just not factual.
You have children, correct?
Yes, I have 2 sons,
okay.
2 adult sons.
Our son is 32, almost 33, and I don't remember when he was in school, and he went to school in Nebraska, 2 different school districts, him taking very many classes that had a focus on government. Did your sons do that?
They did, but it's not like when we were in school and you had social studies and American history,
citizenship,
civics. You had student council elections in your classes. You had mock debates. I can, remember in elementary school, debating slavery as a cause for the Civil War.
Oh, my. In elementary school?
In elementary school.
Wow.
And it seems like we need more of those debates today, because people didn't learn it in elementary school, or they're not learning it like they used to. But I don't know if what that says about us, that we don't teach civics like we used to. But again, though, there are more opportunities. I am always encouraged on election days when I see that teenagers have been excused from class to be poll workers, or at the state legislature where they are pages. So I do think there is a lot of encouragement in schools to become aware of the process and take part in it.
Okay. As you're working at your job and you have to contact an elected official for an interview, do you find that that's easy to do, or are there barriers that you encounter on a regular basis? And if so, what are those barriers?
Well, there are always some barriers. You just can't pick up a phone and expect to get an elected official on the line whenever you want to. A lot of times it's a matter of going through a press secretary, requesting an interview with the official, setting up a time and a place. It could be that there's nothing available that day or that week. Other times, their offices will reach out to you and say, are you interested in interviewing this or that lawmaker, and what's a good time for you, or this is the time that he has between a certain half hour. It's easier, though, again, with the advent of email and social media, to have more back and forths. Sometimes I work with Congressman Jim Banks' office. They're very good about getting me access to him. Sometimes out of the blue, he will just email me, and I will email him back, and we'll have a brief email interview. I know he hasn't done it lately, but Senator Donnelly for a while was having every few weeks he would have an Indiana media conference call where he would pick a topic, a bill or a topic in Congress that week, but open it up for questions, and people could ask questions about any number of topics. So while there are just regular barriers on time and place and trying to get somebody, when you want to, I mean, that's always been there and it always will be. Email and social media has made that a little bit easier. Now, I will say I usually go to Washington a couple times during the year. I find it harder sometimes to interview people when I'm in Washington than I do when I'm in Fort Wayne.
Really?
I will have I remember a few years back when Mike Pence was in Congress, I had an interview scheduled with him for his office at a certain time. I showed up early. I waited. Finally, somebody said, "We can't do this right now. He's in a committee meeting that's going to take a vote. Can you wait for a while?" My schedule was such that I had time on my hands, so I waited. Finally, they came to me and said, "We're going to take you to the committee chairman's office and do the interview there." And so we had to go wind our way through the Capitol. And finally, about an hour late, I got to sit down with then Congressman Pence, and had a good interview. But it was just the fact that the time and the place and the fact that he had committee obligations, that proved to be a barrier.
Okay. Having worked in public relations, I've worked in public relations and marketing, and it's been my experience that there are people who are like executive directors of organizations or like they're a key volunteer who are really, I would say, almost frightened of the news media and the kinds of questions they might ask. Do you find that true of elected officials, that they're really wary of the media?
Not at all. They just don't answer questions that they don't want to answer. You can ask them the same question time and time and again, and they will dodge the question. They do try to control the message, whether it's in an interview, a news conference, on social media, what have you. A public official at any level is always going to control his or her message. I don't think, if they are wary, they seldom show it, but they sometimes will just show outright contempt for a question and just refuse to answer it. Interesting.
I've always wondered how you learn to deflect a question and change the subject as fast as some of these people do. It's somewhat impressive that they can do that. Think that fast on their feet.
I think there must be a training ground for that. There's a lawmaker class that they all go to find out.
So when you receive a press release from an elected official, what do you do with it?
It depends. Sometimes that's all you've got to go on. That's your only communication that you're going to get from the official. And you have to make the most out of it. Now, you will get many news releases that really aren't that newsy, but every once in a while they like to, when they introduce legislation, they will send out statements. They will send out the bill. If the bill is in fact written, you will have a lot of information. They will give you contacts of groups that may support their legislation. They'll never give you contacts of groups that oppose the legislation. But a lot of times, a news release is all you've got to go on. One instance of that is votes. on the Senate or the House floor. Sometimes there's a vote late in the afternoon, early evening. There's no way that you're going to get a hold of somebody to explain the vote, and you just have to go with the two-sentence statement that they issue about their vote, and that's the best you can hope for.
Is it me, or has there been a lot happening on Friday afternoons since the last election? Because Friday afternoon would be a good time to release something that you didn't really want to be picked up right away.
Going into the weekend, that is your traditional, let's put it out there and people won't notice anymore. Things are released, though, around the clock. It's just amazing that this administration and the watchdogs on this administration, the major Washington media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the broadcast news networks, at any time, day or night, breaking pertinent news. But yes, there does seem to be a lot more news being made on Fridays than there used to be.
So Friday night might be a good night to stay home, right? As opposed to going out.
If you want to be informed or entertained.
So what's the difference between getting a press release from an elected official versus getting one from a candidate? Do you handle them differently?
Yes and no. I have to be careful. If a candidate wants to just put out information that that person has been endorsed by someone, is going to have a rally, has named a campaign manager or other staff, that's all kind of nuts and bolts reporting. Where you've got to be careful is when candidates are just constantly bashing on the person they're running against. Usually it's a candidate bashing on an incumbent. And you have to be careful that just because the incumbent votes on something at a whatever level it is, city or county council, state legislature, Congress, you just can't always let that person's opponent have a comment on that incumbent's vote just to seek balance. Because number one, the incumbent is the one that's doing the voting and has to explain his or her vote, whereas the candidate who's opposing that incumbent isn't faced. We don't know how that candidate would vote in the identical situation.
And they might not either, really.
But I see that a lot right now in the U.S. Senate race. Both Republican U.S. Representatives Messer and Rokita on a daily basis are critical of Senator Joe Donnelly, whom they hope to unseat. And just every vote he takes, I'm not going to let them weigh in on that. Now, closer to the election, down the line, yes, they will be given more opportunities. We will be doing more head-to-head comparisons. But first of all, there are 6 Republicans running for the nomination in their party, so I'm more interested in how they view one another at this point than how they view Senator Donnelly. It just stands to reason they are all going to be critical of Senator Donnelly. What voters need to know is what differentiates each of these candidates who are running for the Republican nomination.
Just as a point of, so that you know this, the League of Women Voters last January, when we had our organizational meeting for the year and we were looking at things that we wanted to do this year, one of the things that came up was seeing if we could find a way to get the FCC to only run commercials on television and radio that gave a candidate's viewpoint on an issue and got rid totally of opponent bashing, which we never did figure out how we could get the FCC to do that. But it really is disconcerting as a voter when candidates bash one another, but you don't know what they stand for other than bashing their opponent.
Negative advertising works, though.
And that's
it's been proven, and they're never going to run away from it. They're always going to be bashing their opponents, and a lot of campaigns have gotten very sophisticated about doing so. But you're right. I think polls show that voters are turned off by it, but candidates are not going to change their stripes at this point.
Probably not. No. When you and Nikki are working, how do you determine what you're going to cover, and who determines how much of what you've written goes into the newspaper and onto the Journal-Gazette's website?
Well, we are, constricted by space limitations as much as anything. Just the physical space that's in the newspaper. We can write as much as we like for the web, but we still believe that we have paid subscribers who get the paper every morning, and I feel our first duty is to them. So I put more emphasis on the print edition, but then I'm an old timer, so that
me too.
That's natural. But so we have to pick and choose how much time and effort to devote to any story. We have to make judgments on how important we think this story is, how much our readers will care about it. But as I said earlier, she covers mostly state government. I cover mostly federal government. Sometimes we overlap. We've shared bylines before. We've done stories together before. We have collaborated well together, and I'm sure we'll do that in the future. We have to make decisions all the time on what is an actual news story and what we should put in our political notebook column. That column is usually brief items that maybe don't warrant a full-fledged news story, although there have been days when we have written for the website a political notebook item that our editors will say, well, this is pretty good. Let's turn this into a full-fledged story for the daily newspaper. So we'll just do a little more legwork, a few more interviews, and turn it into a story. But political notebook tends to be your briefer items. Look for more offbeat items. Excuse me. Some of them have a little bit of snark or attitude to them that you're not going to see in a straight news story. So we take some liberties there. Okay.
Does Nikki Kelly live here in Fort Wayne, or does she live in Indy?
No, she's in Indianapolis.
She lives in Indianapolis. So how do you I assume that you talk to one another every day, or not?
Not every day. We email. Sometimes we email often. Sometimes we go days without talking to one another. It just all depends on what we're covering. She's coming up on her busy season when the legislature goes into session next year, and both of us will be awfully busy with the elections. While it's a non-presidential election, we're going to have state house and federal congressional elections that are really going to keep us busy.
Okay. Now, your wife, Karen, is the editorial page editor for the Journal-Gazette. And as we were talking before we started taping this, you two don't really work together, do you?
No, we don't. We work on the same floor in the same building, but there is a wall between us in that.
Literal or?
Figurative.
Figurative, okay.
Her office has windows on it. Mine doesn't. So I guess I do have a wall to the world. I'm in a closet of an office with no windows. But no, we have always at the Journal-Gazette tried to keep editorial content and news content separated. Now, that does not mean that if an editorial writer is working on something that he or she won't talk to a news reporter to gain greater insight on a topic. But as a rule, the editorial board meets separately from the news side and decides what they're going to pursue and how they're going to pursue it.
Okay. Kevin Leininger at the News Sentinel interviewed me when we started the League back up again. And for those of you who don't know, the League was really active in Fort Wayne until sometime in the 1970s, and then it died out. And we brought it back 2008, 2009, somewhere in there. And Kevin told me one time when he interviewed me that he gets a lot of his news ideas, or ideas for his news stories from the legal notices, which I thought was really interesting. But then I was at a meeting the other day when somebody pulled out a legal notice, and it was news, literally news to a lot of people sitting in that meeting. Where do you get your news stories ideas?
Boy, they just drop out of the sky. I tell you, I get dozens of emails a day from all sorts of groups and individuals trying to pitch me on stories. I get anonymous phone calls.
Anonymous phone calls?
Yes, we have people that just won't give their name or affiliation, but say you need to be looking into this, or I heard that. So there are all sorts of sources of news, rumors, speculation. You hear things. People talk about things, and you try to find out if there's any truth to the rumor. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. So you just take whatever sources are available, wherever you find things. Government documents are great to go through. That's one. The internet has made things so much easier to search through documents that just you couldn't find when they were just in paper form, locked away into offices. I always have a great deal of fun with the quarterly campaign fundraising reports, just to look at who's giving what to different candidates, and what does that say about that candidate or the person that's giving the money.
So when you're writing a story about campaign contributions and what it says about donors and candidates, how do you go about writing a story that isn't slanted, that's pure fact?
I just try to present the pure fact. I will say, here are people from this area who given to candidate X or candidate Y. And I usually try to choose people who are well known enough that if you see their name, you might say, wow, I didn't know he was for that candidate. And does that make a reader change his mind? Does the donor actually have enough influence and sway to make you reassess the candidate that person is giving to? But I try to do that for all the candidates. I had a recent article about the U.S. Senate candidates, and the point of the article was that none of the Republicans has raised very much money from Northeast Indiana, which is a very Republican part of the state, and that Senator Donnelly, a Democrat, has raised more money in the most recent quarter than all the Republicans combined. But then I broke out who some of the people were giving to the Republicans and to Senator Donnelly, and then the reader can make up their own mind about what that says about the candidate.
Okay. I don't know if you can answer this one 100%, but do people in the news department, both on the news side and the editorial side, do they pay a lot of attention to letters to the editor, or are those out there to get prospective voters to think about an issue?
I think both. I think I love to read letters to the editor. They are all over the place. Some make you mad. Some you learn something you didn't know about. Some are funny. Some are clever. But I think they are well read. I think they're well read by office holders. We'll get op-ed columns written by office holders, often on topics that are raised in letters to the editor. So I think they serve a very important function of keeping everybody on their toes.
I once worked for a newspaper in the advertising department, and the editor of the newspaper would always print below your name in a letter to the editor whether or not you were registered to vote. I just got a look of pure surprise from
no, that's great.
But he was getting really tired of people voicing an opinion who didn't vote, and so he called him on it.
Well, one thing we take great pride in is the fact that we do not allow anonymous letters to the editor.
Do any newspapers anymore?
I don't know. We have some papers that take anonymous rants that people can just call in with a fake name. I know my wife and her staff, everybody that writes a letter to the editor, they call that person to confirm that they are in fact that person and that they wrote that letter, because they are always vigilant for what they call these astroturf letters or turf letters, where a group will write an advocacy group will write a letter and then just have different people sign it and send it to their newspapers, even though those people didn't write the letters. And there are ways that those can be checked, and there are telltale signs on whether a person has actually written a letter to the editor or not. So we reject those.
So that brings up a question. I get a number of emails from different places, and one of the things that some of these groups do is send you a stock letter. And you go into the website and you make sure that your address and phone number and all that's correct, and then you hit submit, and it sends that letter to your congressperson or whoever. And I assume that they wouldn't be opposed if you were to copy that letter and send it off to a newspaper too. Is that kind of thing effective if somebody's getting the same letters over and over and over again? Do you ever hear anything from elected officials about that?
It's funny, the elected officials I've dealt with don't like to talk much about the communications they get from constituents on topics and whether they're for or against. They just generally say, yes, we get a lot of mail on lots of topics.
Oh, interesting.
But I would think that a personal, well-written letter means a lot more than just putting your name on a group's position and sending it in. After a while, it's not going to get noticed.
Yeah. Switching gears a little bit here, where do you get your news? Personally, where do you get your news?
Oh gosh, I've got so many Google alerts on people that I see a wide range of news sources from the far left to the far right, and many in the middle. You know, I'm like a lot of people. I like to read newspapers and magazines and books, but I also like to listen to the radio, watch television, go online. So I get my news from anywhere and everywhere.
So if you were going to evaluate, say, some national newspapers to subscribe to or to at least follow somehow, which ones do you follow?
Well, I've always, because we have it at the Journal Gazette, we subscribe to the Washington Post news service and the Tribune news service. So
Chicago Tribune?
And the L.A. Times and some other papers.
What about the New York Times?
We don't have that, but I read the New York Times online a lot.
I do too.
I do like the Washington Post. I read Politico a lot too. Politico has become an excellent source for federal government and political news.
That's one of my favorites too. And If you are a Facebook user or want to become a Facebook user, I would suggest you go to the League's Facebook page for the League of Women Voters Fort Wayne. We post a lot of news stories there. We try to, as best as possible, post news stories that get both sides of an issue. I posted something from the Journal Gazette this morning.
Thank you.
From the editorial page, and if whatever is posted has a particular slant to it, and I hate to use the word slant, but I'll use the word slant, but it does have some good information in it. We try to flag that at the top so that you know that it may. I hate to use the word skewed, but that's the only word I can think of right now, but have a particular bent toward one side of an issue or not.
You identify whether it's from a Russian or not?
No, because I don't know.
That may be the next step.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's a frightening thing, I think, that the news can be manipulated that way.
It amazes me that more people aren't outraged that Russia is trying to meddle in our political process. I grew up at a time when we lived in fear of the Soviet Union, old Soviet Union. I am old enough to remember the duck and cover under school desks because of the threat of nuclear annihilation.
We went out in the hallway, but
we had, I know, just through the 70s and the 80s, the Cold War. Russia was by far the biggest enemy of the United States, and I don't know what has happened, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And I don't know if it is because the Cold War had finally ended. Russia was basically in a recession or depression for the 90s until the rise of Putin. But the old rivalry isn't what it used to be.
Do you think the rise of ISIS has had something to do with that?
That may have been a factor in that while tensions in the Middle East were always occupying our nation's attention, especially starting with 9/11, it has just really preoccupied us, with ongoing wars that have no end in sight. We are going to be in the Middle East, for as far as you can see in the future, and I think that probably has diminished the threat of Russia in the eyes of many people.
I heard your wife speak the other day at a luncheon, and she gave her definition of fake news as if it's fake, it's not news, and if it's news, it's not fake, which I thought was pretty good. What's your definition of fake news?
I couldn't say it any better than that.
What do you think about this whole fake news thing?
I do think that fake news is actually usually factual information that somebody chooses not to believe because that person's opinions and belief system don't match up with what the facts are telling them. There was a famous quote by the late Senator Daniel Moynihan that went something like, "You are entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts." And that seems to have been turned on its head these days. We had the character, the Stephen Colbert character from his Comedy Central show, when he coined the word truthiness, and that he trusted his gut more than his head. If it felt right in his gut, it must be true. And what was a joke now, I'm afraid, is reality, that people go with what supports their opinions, and they distrust anything that goes against those opinions, although this really isn't a new development, because we've seen this certainly for many years with the debate over whether childhood vaccinations cause autism. That should have been settled a long time ago, but we still have people arguing over that. We see it with global warming and climate change. The science seems settled. Opinion is all over the place. We have it with, in just the past year or two, the Flat Earth Society, the Flat Earthers are making a comeback. And, of course, the argument over whether the Earth is 6,000 years old or 4.5 billion years old. The science is in on all of these issues, but a lot of people don't buy the science.
And that's true. We talked a little bit about Jeff Goldman earlier. He spoke at Achtuth Veshalom on the Rifkin campus the other night. It was Monday night of this week, of the week that we're recording. It's November 2nd. And he said something surprising to me, but that I've heard from professional journalists before, and that is that he doesn't vote, or at least he didn't before he was retired, because he felt that it compromised his ability to be impartial when he did a news story. What do you think of that, a journalist who doesn't vote?
Oh, I can respect that. I personally do vote, although not in races that I cover regularly.
Really?
So in 2016, I regularly was covering the 3rd District congressional race and the U.S. Senate race. So I did not vote in those two. Now, I covered when Ted Cruz was in town running for president. I covered a couple of his rallies when the debate between the candidates for Indiana Superintendent of Public Instruction, Nikki Kelly would have covered that, but it was in Fort Wayne, so rather than drive up here, she had me cover it. I still voted in that race because I didn't consider covering one debate, or in the case of the presidential election, covering a couple of rallies. I didn't really consider that a regular coverage of candidates. But when it came to Congress and Senate, I skipped those.
That's interesting. I find it somewhat surprising, I guess, that journalists do that sometimes.
Of course, the problem is that, especially in primaries, sometimes you have so few races that
well, that's true.
You end up, because you disqualify yourself from a couple of them, you end up only voting for 2 or 3 candidates then.
What do you think Americans can do to improve news coverage?
Subscribe to the newspaper.
Subscribe to
the Journal Gazette today.
Okay. That's your free commercial.
By subscribing to newspapers, listening to radio stations, supporting whatever media, you will hopefully increase their revenue, and they hopefully will hire more reporters and editors and photographers and cover stories better. Really, I mean, just become more involved and engaged, and I think news media will take notice of that. We always like to see when real people are willing to put, their names on their letters to the editor, or are willing to be interviewed for a story and put their name, and so you can attribute information or an opinion to a real person, or when people show up at rallies or hearings or meetings and are willing to take a stand on something, we will cover that, and that in turn will improve our news coverage. We just don't want to write about the public officials. We want to write about how their decisions affect the people of the community, and so we love it when people let us know what they think of political decisions, and just don't, there's an attitude by some people, you can't beat City Hall, you can't, my vote doesn't matter. Well, we've seen time and time again that an informed voting populace does make a big difference.
And that if you want to see change in government, then you have to speak up and not complain, but be a proactive kind of person who gets involved.
Yes.
Yeah. We have just a little bit of time left. I wanted to promote the League of Women Voters website. It is www.LWV for League of Women Voters, FW for Fort Wayne.org. On that website, we have a list of books that members and friends of the League have read all the way through and recommend. And I want to ask Brian, what have you read lately about politics or government or current events that you think is very interesting?
Senator Al Franken's book, Giant of the Senate, is hilarious, but it is also a great behind-the-scenes look at how someone becomes a political candidate and the work they have to put in and all the potholes they have to dodge or step in. It's a fascinating read, and I would recommend that highly to anybody regardless of your political persuasion. Okay, well, I'm going to have to add that to my to-read list. I've wondered about that. I find it so interesting having watched him on Saturday Night Live when he first got started in show business up until now when he's a senator. And it's just a really interesting transformation of him as, was it Stuart Smalley was the character he played? And I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. And now that now he's a U.S. senator, and it doesn't equate, but he's a smart guy. But he's funny again. Yeah, that's the important thing. When he first took office, he made a concentrated effort, and he talks about this in the book, of that he wanted to be seen as a serious, I think a workhorse rather than a show horse. And he lost his funniness, and along the way he regained that. I think as he gained experience and approval, that he's now back to being very funny. And this book is hilarious in many places. And a sense of humor always helps us to get through this world. Another good resource for books to read is the website goodreads.com. You don't have to be a Facebook member to be on Goodreads, but it does make it a little bit easier. And readers get to write evaluations of books, reviews of books, and rate it on a 5-star basis as to whether it's a 1, which is like don't bother, or a 5, which is this is the best book I've ever read in my life. So there is another resource for you, and a good one. Since we are in the public library in downtown Fort Wayne, we always encourage you to read and to be a patron of the library. You're listening to WELT 95.7 FM in Fort Wayne. WELT comes to you from the main library downtown and via the tower at IPFW. WELT is also generously funded by the Friends of the Library, a terrific group to which I belong. And the Friends of the Library encourages all Allen County residents to come to any library branch and to read a book. This is Nancy McCammon-Hansen. I am the convener of the Fort Wayne Area League of Women Voters. I'd like to thank Brian Francisco from the Journal-Gazette. He's been a great guest, and I think we've had a great conversation today. So please do come back and listen to our other programs. You can pull up past programs on our website and give them a listen too, and we thank you very much.